Welcome to the Ephesiology podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the early Christian movement and its implications for the church today. Today, we're with Michael, our resident ephesiologist, and I'm Matt Till in the suburban sprawl of Chicago, Illinois. And today we have something special. Michael was actually a special guest on another podcast recently, and we're going to have an opportunity to replay that on the topic of really this notion of the importance of theology in discipling your kids. Now, Michael, that sounds like kind of scary, the word theology.
I know, doesn't it? It can be intimidating to parents to think that there's some aspect of theology in how we engage our children with the topics of the Bible and so on. And so, yeah, I was happy to be on a podcast with Kyle Bartholic, who's the pastor of discipleship at Christ Community Church in Ames, Iowa. And we had a wonderful time talking about that role that theology plays in discipling our children, but also trying to take the fear out of it. I mean, it's one thing for people like us who have been trained theologically to talk about theology with our children. For others, it can be a little bit intimidating.
Well, I can't wait for us to be able to listen in and dig in this material with you. So without further delay, here is Michael's interview.
Now, again, for you, for me, we have advanced theology degrees. Adelaide sits down at the counter with me, and we can talk about the evidence, right? The logical argumentation of the resurrection. We can talk, but if I'm a parent, I don't have an advanced theological degree. But it's still just as important to be able to know what I believe so that I can have those conversations in those moments so that Christianity can be taught or caught, not just necessarily taught. So if I'm a parent and I don't have this advanced theology degree, how do I, Michael, what are some practical steps or how am I supposed to teach theology to my kids when I don't even, before this episode, I couldn't even define what theology was?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first answer to that, of course, is to attend church. Find a good, theologically sound church like what you have there in Ames, and that's an important starting place. And I think too to even go more deeply and be involved in a community, because again, theology isn't done in isolation, and it's best done in a community where you're wrestling through these things together. And then as I think about theology and places to start, I always think that the starting spot is God. We need to have a really good understanding of who He is, and so pick up a good theology text on the doctrine of God, or a couple different ones to grow in your personal understanding of who He is. So I mean, those are good starting places.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate, again, as you mentioned, the first place to go is the local church, right? Is that, we need to be in and we need to be plugged in faithfully into the local church. It's what God has given us. It's a global movement. It's not just in the West. And we've seen Hebrews, right? They do not forsake meeting together, this idea. Now, that didn't mean, in that context, that did not mean colossal buildings, large gathered worship. It really meant community, small home churches. And but faithfully being a part of that kind of community. And we even see in Acts, in early Acts, right? Acts chapter 2. What are the early disciples, the early church? What are they doing? Well, they're devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching. They're writing new songs. They're singing hymns. They're sharing in the Lord's Supper. So they're doing these rhythmic things that we do at church, and that's how we kind of come to why do we do what we do at church, and it comes out of the scriptures. And so I think you're right. I know I appreciate that, and with just even watching that over the years of knowing you, it's been 16 years now that we've known each other, and watching that in your life of pursuing and connect. You could go anywhere, right? You could watch any service online that you want, and yet I know that you've consistently been plugged into the local church wherever you've been. And so I've appreciated that in your life, and just even your answer. How do I do this as a parent when I don't have an advanced degree? The first place is a local church, and so that's encouraging, and it's a great first step. Now, I've heard it said this way, and that when I read one author, I become a clone. When I read two authors, I become confused, and when I read 10,000, I become informed. So again, as you said, hey, pick up a theology text. What might be? Is there a book on your mind that would say, hey, this is a great dip your toes into deeper realms of theology, and for you, Michael, as a lifelong learner, what's the importance of having voices that kind of challenge you, or even maybe rub you the wrong way as you are learning and growing?
Well, the two books come immediately to mind in terms of dipping your toes into the theological waters. One is one that was so informative in my life as a young Christian, but also as I grew in my faith. But J.I. Packer's Knowing God. It's a classic text.
Yeah.
That has been made more accessible. Now, I remember when I read it, boy, I thought I understood it, but was thoroughly confused by it just because of the language. But it's much more accessible these days. So I'd pick up that. That's a wonderful book about who God is, and really understanding, our relationship to Him, but His sovereignty, His awesomeness, His majesty, and those things are critically important. And then I would put that book alongside of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's classic discipleship book. The English title, or the early English title, was The Cost of Discipleship, and that was a title that the publisher gave to it, and it wasn't the title of Bonhoeffer's book. But Bonhoeffer originally wrote the book. It was just simply called Discipleship. Yeah. And today's translations of it, the good, I would suggest, the good translations of it just use the title Discipleship. And I'd read that. I love where he goes with his understanding of Christ and his understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. Because if we don't get that part right in our own lives, then it's very difficult to teach our children how to be disciples of Christ. Yeah. And what I love especially about Bonhoeffer is how much of an emphasis he has on not just simply believing in Jesus, that's critical, but living like Jesus lived. And it's for children, this is so important. And parents, you all know this, that you can tell your children 1,000 times to do something, and they might not get it until they actually see what it looks like for that thing to be done. It's the same in discipleship. We might teach our children 1,000 times that this is what Jesus said, but until they see us living that out, they might not get it. And that's what Bonhoeffer really focuses on in his book on discipleship, is not just the believing, but the behaving like Jesus. So those two books, I think, are wonderful texts to read side by side to help in your own personal growth in theology and discipleship.
That's so helpful. I know a text that I stumbled upon, I think early years at Trinity, was Alistair McGrath's Knowing Christ, and just not a crazy long read, and not even a deeply technical read, but just a really good assessment of who Jesus is, what we believe, what we foundationally believe in the Scriptures teach about Christ and about who Jesus is. And so, that's I appreciate that. Yeah. And a second question again was, what is the importance or the role that for voices that you don't agree with, right, that might rub you the wrong way? I think the tendency can be, right, we're plugged into a good church. We're in a small group with people that we are, reading the Scriptures, studying, praying together. So we're in that community. Maybe we're pursuing some podcasts. We're listening to, the Knowing God podcast. I think that's John Piper's,
Mhm.
podcast, or with the Tim Keller podcast, or, whatever, pick any big kind of evangelical, uh, uh, theologically centered pastor, you listen to his podcast, or, and we can get caught in some echo chambers, right? We can get caught in some of these worlds that we only read, listen to, or look at the things that we already agree with. So in your life and experience, how important have been exposing yourself to some voices that challenge your thinking? And you may not agree with them to begin with, and you may not agree with them to end the conversation with. But how has that sharpened you in reading those or listening to those voices?
Yeah, I mean, for me, because I kind of walk in the academic world,
Hmm.
I continually put myself in those contexts where I'm with or listen to or read theologians or academics that I might not necessarily agree with, but they do help
Yeah,
me sharpen my own personal thoughts about a particular issue.
yeah,
Um, I think this is important when we're talking about God and about Christ,
hmm,
especially. There are many competing views about who Jesus is, and we should be informed by those views. They should challenge us, and they should be used to help to strengthen our own personal views
yeah,
of those things. So, yeah, and even among and this, I think this is one of the things that is important for us as we think about what theology is and how we apply it in our lives, is that there are, and this was coming out of the early church. There
hmm,
there have always been theological struggles,
yeah,
and what I love about the early church and the development of theology was that they would come together and arrive at consensus on what we might call core doctrines of the
yeah,
church. But they also distinguish those core doctrines from theological opinions
yeah,
that very well studied theologians would have.
yeah,
The Greek word for this is theologomena. And there were many theological opinions. And so I think it's
yeah,
important for us to navigate these things between what is a core doctrine and what is a theological opinion.
yeah,
And again, I think, those that happens not always. I mean, there are churches that have different opinions that not all churches hold. I mean, that's why we have something like I can't remember how it's in the book that you read there, but
mm,
something like 60,000 different evangelical, or maybe it's 30,000. I don't remember now the number, but 30 to 60,000 different evangelical denominations,
yeah,
and it's because there have been disagreements on different theological opinions
yeah.
rather than on core doctrines. And so we have to learn how to navigate those, listen to them because sometimes they're important, but navigate them in a community where that there
Hmm.
is a real grasp of what those core theological doctrines are.
I appreciate that. I appreciate your historical perspective on that. And you're right. I think, even when we read the book of Acts, sometimes I think what's helpful when we read the scriptures and we look at the context of the scriptures, we begin to understand the timeline, right? How long these conversations, the scope, it wasn't just that, especially when we look at Acts. It's not just that Acts chapter 2 happens, Pentecost, the Spirit comes down. We have these mass conversions. The early church has rapid growth. And then by the time Acts closes, it's like two weeks later. All right. Sometimes when we read the scriptures, it can feel that way. It can feel that these things happened really quickly. But for the first 10 to 15 years of the early church, one of the biggest debates was the process of salvation. Did you need to convert? If you're a Gentile, do you need to convert to Judaism first before you can then convert to Christianity? That conversation takes 10 to almost 15 years or
Mhm.
so until Peter steps in at the Jerusalem. Peter steps
Yeah.
in, and then Paul steps in. We have the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, and you have these two heavyweight voices that finally say no. Peter has a vision from the Lord. Acts chapter 10, I believe, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he has this vision from the Lord, and that begins to give illumination. And then finally, the Jerusalem Council in 15, and you finally have these voices and they say no. So that's a bit of practical theology, right?
Right, absolutely.
Do I need to do this religious thing in order to be connected to Christ? That conversation took 10 plus years. We don't always think it does, but in the process even of our own lives, our development is going to take time. And I think, as you said, just having those other voices helps me to see that historical perspective, right? And separate, what is theological opinion versus actually what is core doctrine or core essential belief. And then it builds, honestly, I don't know about you, Michael, but it builds in me a gracious and generous spirit.
Right.
So look and say, hey man, some really, really smart people over the years didn't agree on this stuff. And I'm not nearly as smart as they are. So I can be gracious in this. I happen to know what I believe, but I can be gracious in response to those who might think otherwise or think differently. And, and so I think that's important. For me, that's been an important part of having other voices that I may not agree with or I may not jive with. They build a graciousness within me when I listen to them and walk through. So I appreciate
I love how you put that. Yeah. Well, so important for us to be able to live in grace and unity with all brothers and sisters. And that grace and unity comes around a good understanding of what those core doctrines are that we all agree on, and we have all agreed on for all time, everywhere in the world.
Yeah. We have to look at those things, especially when we are assessing, where are we at and what does the church actually believe and those kind of things. That's one of the things I've loved in student ministry when we've taken mission trips. One of the things we've done here at Christ Community, we have a trip we take to the Baja area in Mexico. And one of the most fundamental and foundational truths that it shows our students, and they walk away every single year. We go to church and we're singing songs. They're singing in Spanish, and a lot of times we know the songs, right? Because they're singing a lot of the same worship songs that we sing. But they're getting an exposure to the global church, and they're walking away going, "These are our brothers and sisters in Christ. They're in a different location. They're in a different context. They speak a different language, but we worship the same God, right?" There's something very important and grounding to that aspect, and again, that's not something you can just sit in a classroom and be taught. That's something that has to be caught along the way, and we can have those experiences even within the States. We don't have to travel internationally to do that, but those are important things.
Well, thanks for doing theology in community with us today here on the Ephesiology podcast. You can learn more about Ephesiology and our growing global Ephesiology community at Ephesiology.com. Also, to learn more about upcoming courses and even resources for you as a parent as you look to disciple your children in the ways of Jesus and to live on mission. Continue to get other free resources as well for you and your church and your leadership teams. Again, that's found at Ephesiology.com. So for Michael and myself, we'll talk again next week right here on the Ephesiology podcast.